In order to prosper, we value identifying what is most relevant to measure and then precisely measuring it. As an example of the enormous potential advantage of being attentively precise over being negligently imprecise, or negligently presumptive, let's consider a brief example. The subject of the example may even be relevant to you. Imagine that in a particular geographic area, there have been 3 straight years of increasing optimism about future prices for real estate. Researchers conducted surveys to measure what percentage of people reported an expectation that real estate prices would rise in the following year. The average increase in optimism, not in prices, has been 14.25% per year for those 3 years. We could take that information and then project that into the next year and then we could project that in the next year, once again, optimism will rise by that same average amount. So based on the information given so far, that projection seems like a reasonable speculation, right? Now let's get more precise and find out if that projection still seems reasonable. Of course, we'd only be interested in testing this projection if we deemed it to be relevant to us personally. So for the sake of this example, imagine that you're either considering buying a home in that geographic area or that you already own a home there. So that's going to give some context to how we think about this data. If we weren't interested at all in the data, then we would not look at it. But let's imagine that we're quite interested, or that you're quite interested and I'm quite interested in looking at this data. So we want to look at it a little closer. Next, imagine that the specific data on optimism for real estate was 92.75% optimism recently, and 87.5% the year before, 75% the year before that, and 50% the first year measured. So that's 4 pieces of information, 4 numbers, right? Now, how many of them are needed to assess the credibility of the speculation that optimism in the next year will rise 14.25% from current levels? Another 14.25% higher than current levels. The correct answer is that only 1 piece of information was relevant. If you understand that the percentage of people reporting optimism cannot be higher than 100%, then you realize that if the current optimism level is at 92.75%, then you know that the absolute logical maximum increase would be another, what it would take to get it up to 100%, another 7.25%. To go from 92.75 to 100, that'd be 7.25. The percentage mathematically cannot rise by another 14.25%, because that would be 107% total, and 100% is the logical maximum. So now, what if a headline, newspaper headline, or a report, maybe an ad that you see online or something, what if that reports that 107% of the people who were surveyed reported optimism about future real estate prices? Well, that's probably not from a real study about real estate optimism, right? That's like saying 107% of voters recently cast ballots in the recent election. That might be evidence of vote fraud. You can't have, in certain cases, a percentage higher than 100%. It's simply impossible for the percentage to legitimately, accurately be higher than 100%. So there was very little information presented at first. There have been 3 straight years of increasing optimism with an average annual increase of 14.25%. That information was accurate. That is actually, if you add up the increases and divide it by 3, it comes out to 14.25. So that information was accurate, but it wasn't very useful. In fact, it was even misleading if not put in, extra context. It could be misleading. People could be confused by it. That's the point. So it would be much more useful to report the survey results in the following way. Each of the last 3 years, the percentage of people reporting optimism got halfway closer to 100%. Let's see. Now I'm going to, with that context, I'm going to explain it to you from old to new. It started at 50%, then rose halfway toward 100%. What would that be? Up to 75%. And then from 75% up halfway to 100%, that pattern, the pattern of going up half the way towards 100% repeated. Again, it rose from 75% to 87.5%. And then again, the same pattern rose to 92.75%. In fractions of sixteenths, this makes it a little easier to follow the numbers. The optimism was 8 out of 16, or 8/16 of those surveyed, then 12/16, then 14/16, then 15/16. So it's just getting closer to 16 out of 16. But you can't have 17 out of 16 or 16.5 out of 16. You can't do that. That's not how this kind of a survey would work. You survey up to 100% of the people, in the survey, up to 100% of the people can report a particular answer, but no more than that. That's it. So that is a much more precise and useful presentation of information, to say that it was going up halfway towards 100% 3 years in a row. That's much more useful and precise than only reporting that the average annual increase for the last 3 years was whatever amount. Is it beneficial to know which information is most relevant or useful, and then to specifically obtain that information first? Could it be confusing to have a massive amount of information thrown quickly around and have that be presented without the information being well organized? Could that be confusing? It certainly could, and we might find that to be the case, whether that is in a sales pitch, an advertisement, a presentation like in a school setting. There could be a lot of information presented in a way that is not well organized. It's not easy to learn and understand. So with the example above, you might have experienced some amount of confusion at some point. For some people, the experience of confusion can be quite embarrassing or even terrifying. We may learn the idea that it's best to avoid all confusion, as well as to avoid any social recognition or social display of the experience of confusion. We might learn that as an idea. I'm not saying that I agree with it. In fact, I reject that idea. I don't think that it's best to always avoid all confusion. That's actually kind of ridiculously extreme. In some cases, we want to minimize confusion. We want to perhaps in some cases keep private that we're confused, but to always obsess over hiding the display of the experience of confusion, that's going to be exhausting. So confusion is a normal part of the learning process. And if there's confusion about some information that I consider important, then I can resolve my confusion or my uncertainty by researching that subject. Only if I consider it important. Most things that I find confusing, I don't care. I hardly even notice that they're confusing to me because they're not a priority. I don't identify them as a priority. So in the example just presented in regard to real estate prices, my intention, or optimism about real estate prices, my intention was to demonstrate the importance of the issue of clarity, especially clarity about what information is the relevant priority. I did that by presenting a possible source of a small and inconsequential confusion, which was easily clarified. Basically, two different ways of presenting the same information. The second one was really clear and simple. The first way I presented, or the first couple ways, they were not as easy to understand. Not as easy to get what's really going on. The simplicity even of what's really going on. So the simpler explanation often is a really good place to start, I'll put it that way. So since many people have a tremendous sense of urgency or paranoia about avoiding social criticism and also about competing for social validation, they may orient themselves in a mode that I call perfectionism. And that means that they are consistently attempting to avoid making any mistakes or experiencing any confusion. At least that's one version of perfectionism. No mistakes, no confusion, and they can have that orientation compulsively or hysterically with the interest in avoiding any social recognition that they may still have something to learn. That's really the great threat that is behind perfectionist social displays, commentaries, and so on. When people are saying, no, that's not at all how I am, or that's not what I meant, or whatever. If they're depending on how they respond to the question, it can be really notable the intensity and passion of their denials. What if I still have something to learn and I don't mind acknowledging that, admitting that, having other people recognize that? I may know a lot. I may know things that are really valuable to me, but do I know everything that could be relevant? Probably not, right? So in perfectionism, we have this avoidance of any confusion or, as a target, or the avoidance of all mistakes, or, oh, we can't have any expectations because they might be violated by our actual observations. What? We're going to have expectations. We're going to have observations. Sometimes they'll match. Sometimes they won't. How is that a problem? It's just not a major problem if somebody's socially comfortable and relaxed. If somebody experiences a social threat, they're going to be condemned or criticized for an error, then that's going to correspond to anxiety, stress, distress, and so on, and maybe pretenses and hiding and these strange obsessions about always being perfect and never being confused and never making any mistakes. The best way to not make any mistakes is to never make an effort, to never make an attempt where there could be an error. So you can get that eventually when we take these ideas to an extreme, they just are paralyzing. They're not functional. So in order to avoid being recognized as being presumptive or presumptuous, some people may experience distress just about the possibility of actually testing their presumptions. To test a presumption is kind of admitting it might not be accurate. It's only a presumption, actually. I'm going to test it now because I'm not totally sure. So in that mode of great distress, people may avoid assessing their priorities. They already have it all together. Maybe that's their pretense. Or their priorities can't have changed in the last 20 years, the last 3 years. Well, maybe their priorities have changed in the last few minutes. So in a state of kind of dysfunction, people might avoid assessing their priorities. I'll talk about how to effectively assess priorities later, because some people will say, well, I don't really know how to do that. That's actually great. If you're interested in assessing priorities and don't know how to do it, we'll come back to that soon. So people may be interested in avoiding recognizing their priorities, or speculating about their priorities, and also they may be kind of obsessive about avoiding identifying what presumptions are most relevant to them. We don't want to say that I might not want to say that I have any presumptions, and I might not want to say, well, those are relevant presumptions. If I avoid assessing my priorities, avoid prioritizing my presumptions, and then avoid testing those presumptions, that's going to produce very limited success or catastrophe. So if it would be extremely beneficial and easy for you to do, would you be open to learning something new? That's a fun way of asking that question. If it would be extremely beneficial and easy, would you be open to learning something new? Note that for something to be easy for you in the future, that doesn't require you to already know how to do it easily. You might learn how easy it is in the future. The new things that would benefit you most could be things that don't seem currently easy to you, or you probably would have already done them, but you might find them to be easy if effectively guided. Through observing your own patterns of experience and behavior, you can discover how your priorities change over time. You can also identify what presumptions about social or economic conditions would be most relevant for you to monitor or test. In the event that you test a presumption and the measurement that is recorded or registered does not match the presumption, then the test can be repeated until it is clear that the presumption was imprecise and should be updated or revised or replaced. So if you are interested in financial wealth and profitable investing, or if you become interested in that at some time, then it could be relevant for you to obtain the input of someone who understands the simplest foundations of how prices change, and someone who can also easily and clearly communicate those issues to you about how prices change. Once you're confident in the value to you of their expertise, and also confident in their interest in giving you the value of their expertise, then you can do what it takes to get that value for yourself. Now, you might not care specifically about future real estate prices in whatever area, or patterns of rising and falling optimism. Maybe there are other things that you care about more, and that's fine. Whatever priority is your priority, that's where to start. However, for those of you who are interested in why some researchers measure the amount of optimism relating to any particular investment market, here's a quick hint, and then we'll conclude. When we look back, not just 3 years, not just 3 decades, or even but I said that wrong. When we look back, not just 3 years, but further back, like 3 decades or 3 centuries back, we might see a pattern in regard to what consistently happens when optimism about future prices rises above 90%. Rather than continuing to increase above 90% all the way up to, say, 107%, we see that optimism always, or we might find that optimism always eventually falls below 90%, sometimes suddenly. We might also note that the biggest declines in price consistently happen when optimism is furthest above 90%. Now, if you have the opportunity currently or in the future to borrow large amounts of money to speculate on future real estate prices, then you might be interested in current trends in relation to optimism, as well as other trends besides optimism that reliably forecast future price movements in any particular market, real estate or otherwise. With real estate, there's a lot of data, so it's kind of one of the easiest to forecast in the sense of long-term forecasting. For instance, with regard to real estate, we could look at changes in the volume of mortgage applications that have been submitted. That tends to correspond to future borrowing and purchasing activity. Just look at the data of mortgage applications that have been submitted, or look at the volume of approvals for financing. After those applications are submitted, do they get approved or not? We can measure changes in demand, the willingness of people to buy, the ability of people to buy. We can measure changes in demand like that, as well as changes in supply. That would be like the inventory of new homes that are listed for sale, again, within a particular region. So there's lots of data available, and in regard to real estate prices in particular, myself and many other people forecast the big declines in real estate prices that happened close to 10 years ago. This is 2015 now that I'm recording this, the end of 2015. And 2003 was the first time I published forecasts of a real estate decline. Other people published similar forecasts based on similar data prior to my publications and subsequent to my publications. My particular bias was that fuel prices would rise, in particular in certain places that were really desperate for fuel, that didn't have a lot of fuel being produced and refined there, but that used a lot of fuel. In those places, fuel prices could rise tremendously and quickly and would interrupt other spending patterns, including the purchasing of stocks for stock markets, as well as things like putting money down to buy real estate. Just all sorts of buying activities and buying patterns changed around 2007 and 2008 when prices for a gallon of gasoline reached over $11 per gallon in certain parts of Europe. That really shifted the buying patterns of businesses and consumers to have to pay over $11 per gallon. So I wrote about that in 2004 and 2005 and so on. And that rising of fuel prices, I explained why they would rise. As they rose, I explained what other consequences there would be, kind of what I call the domino effect, taking the word domino effect or the phrase domino effect. I just added an IL at the end of domino, called it the domino effect, and talked about how rising fuel prices would set off a cascade of other changes. So, including changes in international borrowing and lending habits or patterns. So as lending and borrowing patterns change, one of the markets that I was very clear would be most altered by those changes in borrowing and lending would be real estate, because so many real estate transactions as of 2003, 4, 5, and so on. At that time, there was so much real estate transactions that were financed through borrowing. In fact, still is a pretty high percentage of real estate transactions are financed. So I gave a little more detail there on the background than I originally planned, but the idea of finding, discovering through like studying your own patterns of behavior, discovering what your priorities are, that's something that I'm open to helping people do, and then determining what presumptions are relevant, and then researching those presumptions. If there are already presumptions that have been researched by me, then it'll be that much faster, that much easier. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and feel free to contact me if you found it interesting. And you can also share it if you would like. Share it with a particular person, or share it wherever and however you see fit. Thanks.